To get us going with our first presentation is Gregory Graves, who's going to talk about the United States and Cyprus from the Greek War of Independence to the 1974 crisis. By the way, we're not going to be given bios of the speakers. The bios are listed in print in your program. You can look at them and see the great credentials of all our speakers. But for purposes of time, there will not be any major introductions of the speakers. Harris Mylonas, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, will act as the chair and have a discussion with Gregory at the end of his presentation. Just one quick word about Gregory Graves. He's not Greek Cypriot, he's not Greek American. He's an American who really taken this issue to heart many, many years ago. And we'd like to take just a little bit of credit as being the catalyst in terms of having him take more interest in the subject matter when he came to us, recommended by his godparents, Angelo Tsakopoulos from Sacramento. And I think everyone in this room knows who Angelo Tsakopoulos is. But we understood immediately the intelligence factor of Gregory Graves. And so we wanted to give him something really deep to dig into. So we asked him to look at FOIA requests. And he gathered about 10,000 pages of FOIA requests, all of July and August of 1974. That are now sitting in our special collections room at AHI. But he's taken it a step further, and he's doing his whole dissertation on the Cyprus issue, and he's taking it from different angles. Now, as he likes to say, when you dig down that deep, you might find sometimes they're not always the things you might want to hear. Okay, but I told him we got to deal in the Henry Kissinger realpolitik world today in this room. So be as it may, it is a great pleasure to invite him to the podium and to have this presentation today by Gregory Graves. I think you will find his presentation quite interesting. Gregory?
It is a great pleasure to be here today, and Nick, don't worry, I've taken your words to heart and I'm channeling my best inner realist. So what I want to do hopefully briefly, is kind of provide a thumbnail sketch of some of the factors that I think contributed to 1974. How did we get here in a broader historical sense? Okay, and sometimes historians of American foreign relations seem, as one historian put it, just as frustrated secretaries of state. And that author didn't have the pleasure of trying to navigate the USA Jobs website and trying to actually find employment at the State Department. I'm about 2 weeks away from being thoroughly convinced of Kissinger's entire critique of the bureaucracy. So if you'd invited me a little later on, the content might have been different. Nonetheless, I've tried to make my judgments as Catholic as possible. And my exploration of Cyprus has kind of given rise to two competing views. On the one hand, after World War II, the chemist and diplomat James B. Conant rejected the idea of inevitable human progress. He believed that tragedy would probably persist as a constant aspect of the human drama. On the other hand, in June 1963, in I think one of the best presidential speeches ever, at least in the 20th century, President Kennedy proclaimed that our difficulties are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man. We are not gripped by forces we cannot control. We have solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we can do it again. And I think history here can provide some help in this process, but I think the important thing to remember is that the historical process is about going back into the past and returning with a wider and more intense consciousness of the restrictions of our own former outlooks. As Kennedy said in 1963, we should begin by looking inward, by examining our own attitude. As Mr. Rosides wrote in April 1988, Cyprus is a forgotten issue. The press, the academy, other forums neglect the issue. I could be saying the exact same thing today, unfortunately. Yet Rosides maintained that Cyprus was not simply a Greek-Turkish parochial dispute. It was an American problem which is important to American foreign relations. And I thoroughly agree. What I would suggest is that it is far more intimately connected to U.S. history than Rosides may have realized in 1974. And the roots of this conflict and America's involvement in the issue go back much further than even 1945 or the First World War. One of the kind of main schools of thought surrounding the Cyprus conflict that I hear in various forms is that this is just another example of age-old Greek and Turkish conflict. And this, you will find, is a view that was held by a number of people in the State Department and the Defense Department in 1974. I believe his deputy chief of mission in Athens between 1970 and 1974 later asked a colleague during an interview, do you think that diplomacy could have done much since the Greeks have been going at each other since the time of Darius? And his colleague responded by acknowledging the complicated history, but he was nonetheless, quote, dissatisfied with the flaccidness of our policy, and he would have appreciated a more aggressive effort to hammer away at the rocks on which intercommunal relations floundered. And I would echo that wholeheartedly. Now, a post-mortem on 1974 concluded that intelligence analysts essentially assumed that rational men would not make irrational moves. Interpreters may have been persuaded by the fact that it would be irrational for the leader of Greece to risk war with Turkey, the wrath of the United States, possible intervention of the Soviet Union, all for the sake of Cyprus. And I've come back to that several times in my studies, and the first time I saw that about 10 years ago, I thought, you know, I generally don't like claiming someone is rational or irrational. I don't think that's a good basis for statecraft. When I came back a second time, I realized that assessment wildly understates the significance of Cyprus to both Greece and Turkey. And if you look in the diplomatic record, you will see from the 50s onwards, various American diplomats saying, this is really just a small issue. This is a side problem. Don't let it, distract us from the broader issue of containing the Soviet Union. And this had been said so many times that on the one hand it lost meaning, and on the other hand it seemed as though the Americans had not really tried to fully understand the roots of the problem and why it was so important to not only people on the island, but also people elsewhere in the Aegean. And so what I want to do is therefore sketch out some of these historical roots and focus generally on three issues or concepts. One, the structure of the international system. Two, these competing Greek and Turkish Cypriot nationalisms. And then third and finally, what does this mean for American diplomacy? Because I would suggest that what happens in 1974 was not foreordained by any stretch of the imagination, but the U.S. had been well aware of the danger of the problem, not just earlier in 1974, not just earlier in the 70s, but throughout the 60s, throughout the 50s as well. And even if the true story is not as nefarious as many people in the region believe, U.S. policy never did much to dispel these critical assumptions. It was very easy for people in the region to reach these conclusions just by looking at what happened. Because if you peel back the layers, one of the things I want to show is that the strategic considerations of the United States have generally triumphed over this idea that we should be true to our espoused ideals, whether it's anti-colonialism, self-determination. And this is evident all the way back as early as the Greek War of Independence. And at the time in 1974, some people did at least kind of detect or begin to probe these deeper roots. A piece in the Associated Press said that some of the seeds of today's crisis were sown in 1571 when the Ottoman Empire captured the island, and another set were sowed in the 1820s. And due to time considerations and Other factors, I will not get into 1571, but I think there is a very important reason why that should be part of the conversation. If you look at museums in Nicosia, there are references to 1571, and this date seems to be the point of departure for two completely different interpretations about Cypriot history and the collapse of ethnic coexistence. But another critical date is 1821. And so what I want to do is kind of discuss the three factors that I mentioned as themes. I tried to do this chronologically, but it is way too confusing with too many parts. So I just want to briefly talk about the structure of the international system before moving on to the other issues. When the Greek War of Independence erupted, the Concert of Europe had just been formed. And another critical factor is this idea that Russia was casting itself as the protector of the Orthodox subjects of the Sultan. And so when the revolt erupted, there was considerable concern that Russia might intervene on behalf of the Greeks, and this could turn a regional or local problem into a wider conflagration that could upend the entire Concert of Europe. And so you have considerable effort trying to dissuade Russian intervention, even though there were several factors that probably disinclined Russia to intervene at that time, even though there was this kind of attachment via the Greek Orthodox faith, or the Orthodox faith, excuse me. And so what happens is all the great powers share this general idea. We want to preserve continental stability. But there are these different secondary and tertiary objectives that are in contrast. And it is in this kind of space that the Ottomans are afforded an extra opportunity to try to repress the rebellion by force. And I see similar dynamics occur over the crisis in Crete in the 1860s. Again, all of the great powers wanted to prevent discord on one island, upsetting the Concert of Europe, but they all had different objectives below that. And in this environment, the British actually say to the Ottoman Empire, we really don't want another phase of the Eastern question or this debate about the decline and parceling out of the Ottoman territories to erupt again. So if you just want to repress this as quickly as possible and use force, go ahead. Okay? Now, in the 20th century, the dynamics shift a little bit, but the structure of the international system, I believe, is still quite significant. Because during the Cold War, the Soviet threat, when it is first emergent, leads to a kind of almost Greco-Turkish détente. They realize they are facing the same adversary, and they are also united in wanting U.S. aid. At these times, they tend to subordinate the Cyprus issue. But when the Soviet threat relaxes, after the death of Stalin in 1953, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and after superpower détente in the early 70s, you see Greece and Turkey are more able to focus on national interests, less concerned with the Soviet threat. And it is, in my opinion, not a coincidence that periods of upheaval over Cyprus coincide with these cycles of détente and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Whether that dynamic still persists in the post-Soviet era, I'm not sure, but I do think it is quite significant. And just as one example, in May 1972, so we're 2+ years before the Cyprus crisis, 2 journalists reported, quote, there was a greater chance of collision between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus than with either country against socialist Bulgaria. After the 74 crisis, an article in Foreign Affairs noted that Secretary Kissinger complained a lot about AHI and the effort to embargo arms sales to Turkey. But this article said, you know, some of the real responsibilities are détente, and the other thing he mentioned was Greek and Turkish nationalisms. And so I just want to touch on those very briefly because they are critical to understanding what happens. After Greece develops and emerges as an independent state, the outside powers play a large role in its policy. and you sometimes hear this referred to as the foreign factor. And what more recent research has shown that yes, Britain, France, so forth, did play a lot of, it did have a large influence. At the same time, there were Greek elites who tried to pull in outside forces, gain support from one of the great powers, use this to advance their interests. And so I see this dynamic continuing to develop as the United States moves into the region after World War II. And so the foreign factor becomes the American factor. Within this dynamic, there is this larger kind of nationalist project called the Great Idea, or establishing Greater Greece. And Cyprus is very much part of that. And on the island itself, you have a Greek Cypriot nationalist movement developing as well, based on this idea of enosis. And the core idea here is that Cyprus has really been part of Greece for thousands of years, and that therefore any foreign influences, whether it's the British or others, is therefore due to some kind of illegitimate or underhanded development. And I think you can very much see the kind of views and reactions that develop in Greece and amongst Greek Cypriots about the US role in 1974. That reflects back to this broader development of Greek and Greek Cypriot nationalism. On the Turkish side, the Greek War of Independence is also quite significant, and it triggers a reformist movement. And one of the things that is very interesting, and I tried to cut this but I couldn't, is that there is an increased emphasis on wearing the fez and other traditional garb worn by Orthodox subjects. And Turkey adopted this to show that it was progressing, right? And in fact, many Europeans viewed this as kind of nefarious and threatening. What is interesting is that in subsequent periods of conflict over Cyprus, you see this image repurposed. So in 1964, there is a Greek cartoon where the American president is propping up an enfeebled Turkish prime minister with a six-shooter, because it's Lyndon Johnson, on his hip and a fez on his head. And you see the Greek prime minister sitting on the ground looking away with the dismissive gesticulations, and the comment says, "As your ally, I prefer not to wear," with regards to the fez. And in 1974, you see very similar types of depictions, insofar as Kissinger is perceived as being so pro-Turkey that he is doing their bidding. And you will see many postcards and other representations of Kissinger where he is wearing a fez. Now, beyond headwear, there is a series of reforms that occurs in the Ottoman period that doesn't resolve the kind of fundamental tensions of checking nationalist expansion and outside intervention. And this leads to the forces that shift away from an Ottoman identity towards Turkification. And this is very key because this will influence the development of Turkish Cypriot nationalism, right? And so you have developing around the same time two completely opposed or opposing national identities based on competing claims to the island. And this will contribute to what scholars have called ethnic disaggregation, the collapse of ethnic coexistence. And in 1891, 43% of the villages on the island are mixed. By the time Cyprus becomes independent in 1960, that number is about 15 or 16%. So keeping this ongoing process in your mind is very critical to understand what the US is doing or trying to do, because it has to confront these issues. It doesn't fully understand the nationalisms that are developing in both communities, and it has a very hard time disentangling nationalism from concern about the Soviet Union. And so what does all this imply for American foreign relations? Well, I would go back as early as the Greek War of Independence and say there is all of this interest and support for Greece, but what does the US prioritize? negotiating a commercial agreement with the Ottoman Empire. Later on, when there is another uprising in the 1860s, the US has to consider the fact, again, there's a lot of domestic support for Greeks, but who was one of our strongest allies during the Civil War? The Ottoman Empire. And so once again, the US officially does not get involved. And you begin to see some of the same critiques that are leveled in 1974 develop throughout this period. This idea that the US is primarily concerned with strategic interest, effectively on the side of Turkey, and therefore disinterested in the fates of Orthodox subjects of the Sultan or Greek Cypriots. And this friction between ideals and interests intensifies in the Cold War period because the Soviet Union is depicting itself as the leader of the anti-colonial forces and saying the United States is a poser because it talks about self-determination, but who are its greatest allies? Britain and France. And this is something that people recognize at the time. And one article in June of 1950 says that by supporting the British in Cyprus and by supporting the French in Indochina, the United States is essentially getting itself into situations that it will eventually be on the losing side of. And this tension continues to develop into the 60s. By the time you get to 1960, the question is not, do we prioritize self-determination and anti-colonialism or alliance with Great Britain? The question is now, do we support some kind of agreement between Greece and Turkey that will help invigorate NATO, or do we support the independence and territorial integrity of a UN member state? And over time, it is this consistent interest with maintaining NATO cohesion that eventually leads the United States to subordinate its interest in the territorial integrity of Cyprus. And one of the last things I want to mention is that this is predicted in various times and in various forms before 1974. As early as 1956, a journalist who has just interviewed a Turkish official says, well, this person didn't quite come out and say that they're going to invade Cyprus using American-supplied weapons if the Enosis movement continues, but they thoroughly implied it. And in 1964, you again see this kind of pressure for intervention multiple times. The US dissuades Turkey from intervening. But what is clear is that the Americans realize that they have expended a lot of political capital, and they may not be able to restrain Turkey again. And as early as 1971, the ambassador to Cyprus, briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says, the United States has played God in this situation twice before. If it happens again, can we or even should we try to dissuade a Turkish invasion? Right? And that doesn't mean that the US in 74 allowed this to happen. It did try to, I think in the first couple of days of the crisis, prevent an invasion. But after it realized that that was not viable, it was about controlling the situation as best they could and preserving the NATO alliance. And unfortunately, the Cypriots suffered because of that. And so what I conclude with is quote from Bitter Lemons. The tragedy, Lawrence Durrell wrote in the 50s, was that this didn't need to happen. It's of course wise, you can be wise after the event, but it was very clear that there was enough intelligence in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s for the US to make a greater diplomatic effort. It did not do so for a variety of reasons, one of which was this consistent concern about possibly undermining its strategic interests in the region. Thank you.
I want to thank you for this wonderful, it's not common that we start with an academic talk at a conference, so I think that's refreshing from my perspective. But I want to draw a couple of themes. One has to do with how difficult it is for small states to have independent foreign policy and how difficult it is to navigate the situation, especially in a tough geopolitical space. And I guess you could share some thoughts with us about how this multipolar world that we live in may complicate this even further, because you kind of focused on this bipolar period, and it seemed kind of more easy to navigate in my mind. But now, today, you have regional powers, you have a lot of fluidity, we have a new administration coming in. Any thoughts you can share on that front?
So not only did I take up too much time, but...
Is your mic on? Yeah, I don't know. Is it green? No, now it is, yeah.
Not only did I take up too much time, but I am somewhat flummoxed by this question because it's quite good. And I will say that to a certain extent there is something, you know, if you take away the nuclear weapons and the ICBMs, there is something comforting about the Cold War to a certain extent because you kind of knew who your adversaries were. And in this environment, it is very difficult, not just you know, a multipolar world, but you have a variety of non-state actors that were just kind of developing and coming onto the scene and exerting their influence in the 60s and 70s when this crisis unfolded. And so what I would suggest is that you have to play to your strengths. And one of the things that stuck with me a lot in reading about history is this book called Thinking in Time. And the authors say, well, historical analysis can help us improve our batting average. And I'm using this to kind of appeal to Nick through various levels of mind tricks. But if you look at the most recent World Series, the Yankees had a slightly better batting average, they had more hits, they even hit more home runs, and they were soundly beaten, at least in my opinion, and I say that as a Yankees fan. And so what I've come to realize is that idea about raising your batting average is not the only part of baseball. You have to pitch, you have to get on base, you have to manufacture runs. And I think that there are ways that Cyprus can do this by playing to its strengths. And I generally believe that as long as the conversation is primarily in the geostrategic or the geopolitical realm, Cyprus will not fare as well because the US has so much invested in its strategic relationship with Greece or Turkey. So focusing on the social, the cultural, the economic aspects is, I think, an excellent way to highlight what the island has to offer and how it can be a player in various things beyond the kind of traditional foreign policy questions.
So while I'm waiting for questions from the audience, if you have questions, come to the mic that is in the center here, and I'll call on you. But in the meantime, I was wondering to what extent, just to go back to your historical account, obviously structure matters, but what is the agency you see in these 4 years? What's the role of the Greek junta, for example? I mean, we didn't talk much about that. And there is agency there.
Yep.
And that links to your question about Greek and Turkish nationalism. There's also Cypriot nationalism, and there are local nationalisms. This is discussed as a partition after an invasion, but at the same time we're neglecting there is a lot of irredentism, that is a word that is very prominent these days because of what happened in Crimea and what's happening in Ukraine right now. But we don't often talk about this as a Turkish irredentist policy. So that's a puzzle in a way from my perspective.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And one of the things that I've thought about while studying Cyprus is it better to be an outsider who doesn't really know much about the issue, doesn't speak the language, or is it better to speak Greek or Turkish, have some kind of familiarity with the issue? I have no answer on that, but sometimes when I get questions like this, it is a little helpful, a little easier, I should say, to be an outsider because, of course, it's Turkish irredentism. I couldn't see it any other way, and if you look back at some of the academic journals and intellectual publications that are being produced, especially in the post-1945 period, you start to see intellectuals, commentators, so on and so forth, depicting Cyprus as an extension of mainland Anatolia. I think one of the first journals is called The Green Island or something like that in 1948. And these publications continue over time. And these sentiments are intensifying throughout the 60s and into the 70s, which makes it more difficult for leaders in Ankara and Athens, if they had been inclined to take a more cautious approach. It's very difficult to do so because, as the American ambassador said one time in the 50s, there is no greater vulnerability for a Greek leader than being tagged by the opposition as soft on Cyprus. It was akin to Kennedy not caring about Cuba, right? As much as Karamanlis wanted pro-Western integration, he couldn't ignore this upsurge of support for Enosis amongst everyday Greeks. And the same thing will happen in Turkey over time. Now, the role of the Greek junta is very interesting because on the one hand, there are some people and scholars who are convinced and they say, well, the United States was completely in control of the junta. Nothing that happened in Greece between 1967 and 1974 happened without Washington's permission. When you peel back some of the layers and look at the actual documents, you see that yes, the US had a considerable amount of influence. If it had wanted to use that to push towards a return to democratic governments, it could. But because the US had established bases in both Greece and Turkey, and in the late 60s and early 70s, the US is upgrading this commitment with the junta for a home porting agreement for the 6th Fleet in Piraeus. And there's a document, national security study, that says if we put too much strategic interest in Greece, there will become a point where the United States' ability to comment on, human rights abuses, destabilizing Cyprus, will be limited to almost nothing because we will be so afraid that the junta, or and the same dynamic unfolds in Turkey as well, that they will retaliate by complicating base access negotiations, these sorts of things. And so one of the things that is critical to understand is that all facets of bilateral relations, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Troubled Triangle, are related. Cuts in aid to Greece, base access agreements, all of these things become related to the Cyprus issue over time, especially from the 50s onwards. And there is this concern that if the US pushes too hard on one of these issues, it will compromise a broader and, from Washington's perspective, more significant strategic interest. And so with the junta, the relationship that developed kind of reminds me of Graham Greene's The Quiet American. We gave them loads of money, and in return, we didn't get a valuable ally at all. We just exposed our hypocrisy because we're supposed to be the leader of the free world combating Soviet totalitarianism. But how can that work? And this was the same question that critics of the US colonial policy were asking in the 50s, asking the same question in 1967 and onward. How can the US support democracy and human rights while it's allying with the Greek junta? And these kinds of questions are still very much germane to policy today in different countries. And so it is this tension between ideals and interests that is consistently confounding American policymakers. So just to recapitulate, yes, the US had a lot of influence in Greece, but the Greeks had a lot of leverage over the Americans. The United States put itself in a terrible position by decades of policy that pretty much consistently prioritized the strategic interests at the expense of democracy, human rights, governance in Greece or Turkey.
So I guess we're still stuck in the agency structure debate that is ongoing in political science. We have the first question. Could you identify yourself for the benefit of everybody?
Hello. Is it on?
I think it's on.
Okay. My name is Tony Toumazis. I came from Cyprus only 2 days ago. And I'm not an academic, but I have this image of what's happening in Cyprus and in relation with America, and especially the latest developments that are showing that America is much more interested in Cyprus. And I wanted to express what my impression is, and hear your views, whether it's realistic or is a local image of a Greek Cypriot. Even though I am involved with politics, not in an intensive way.
Yeah.
Okay. The picture we have is that recently, because of the way Turkey is developing and becoming a questionable ally, there is an understanding that America no more can be very dependent on Turkey, even though they don't want them out of NATO. And that's why they are increasing their presence in Cyprus, in Crete, and in Greece as a new red line of defense. And that's what counts instead of the human rights and all that. Thank you.
So I agree with the thrust of the question. My concern is that in terms of getting Washington to do anything, if you look back for decades, the documents make it very clear, going from 1947 onward, the U.S. and the Joint Chiefs of Staff defined both Greece and Turkey as vital to U.S. national security. And then the sentence after that is, and Cyprus is there to support the lines of communication. So we're consistently looking at Cyprus through the strategic lens, not considering the Cypriots themselves. But the sentence after that is that Turkey is more strategically significant for the United States than Greece. And this policy is reaffirmed at several points in the 40s, and I haven't come across anything that challenges that. And so I think that it's very hard for me to see the United States doing anything major to distance itself from Turkey. Now, there are certainly limits to that, but, you know, because of how much strategic capital is invested in the region, I mean, we still have nuclear weapons in Turkey. I don't have much hope for any kind of pressure, meaningful pressure on that front, unfortunately.
So last question from me, and then we're going to pass it on to the next panel. Was there any discussion in the documents you've seen of this becoming an ugly precedent that the U.S. had to manage? Because usually we hear whenever something like that happens, there is a precedent discussion.
Yeah.
Well, how do you?
So there are two kinds of precedents that I've detected. One is this precedent that there could be another Turkish arms embargo. And I don't think that most historians of American foreign relations, even those who work on the 20th century, appreciate how significant that development is. Other than the legislative efforts to force the U.S. and the Soviet Union to make changes to the immigration of Soviet Jews in the 70s, the arms embargo after Cyprus is one of the most major instances of congressional assertiveness in the 20th century, up to that point. And so there are considerable concerns that the same kind of idea could be applied to any number of situations, from the Middle East to East Timor, which descends into a bloodbath a few years later. These same kinds of ideas are very much a concern for American officials. Essentially, how can we keep the arms supply flowing even if there are these extremely unsavory and violent actions going on? And one of the things that is quite clear in the documents is that Kissinger is quite aware of the potential for congressional pushback on this, but he is consistently trying to keep the arms supply going. He holds back some of the more high-value items that are in the pipeline, like F-4 jets. But everything else that has already been approved, he wants to push that through because he is concerned, and this is almost a direct quote, that if it gets cut off, we're never going to be able to get it started again. So that's one precedent. The second precedent, and it's hard to know which is more depressing, is that when Lebanon goes down to civil war and then the Balkans start unraveling, you see invocations of Cyprus in Lebanon, invocations of Cyprus in the Balkans. And there are people asking after the siege of Sarajevo, you know, okay, so the UN is here. How long are you going to be here? The UN says, oh, well, this is just a temporary situation. And some of the journalists who have been around long enough are like, well, you said it was temporary in Cyprus too. And so it is on these two kind of planes in terms of ethnic conflict and partition, and in terms of arms sales, domestic politics, and strategic relations that you see these precedents developing.
Please join me in thanking our speaker, and we'll